Good morning, students. This is the second lecture that we're going to be working on this week, um, where we kind of pick up at the end of Impressionism, and we're going to begin to think about what happens after Impressionism and all of the changes and all the new ways of thinking about art that we learned about. And I'm always going to be giving you guys information about how science, of course, history, technology, is going to be affecting the way artists think about their work. And so we talked about photography last class and how photography is going to seriously affect the way painters look at their work. But now I want to talk about the science of how people see and the new research that is done on literally the way our eye processes information. So there's a large discourse about how people, how humans see the world, and that's really driven by advances in optical science and the way the human eye behaves. The other thing is that there's a new understanding that maybe we all see color differently, right? That there is this kind of subjectivity that comes to the way people perceive color and light. And it's really interesting because you may know someone who's colorblind, or we talk about, do you see that same red that I see? Or do you see that same kind of purple that I do? It's a really interesting question. So the development, the advancements of color theory, of course, the primary colors, the secondary colors, and then an understanding of complementary colors is going to be something very fundamental to the work of the Post Impressionists, and very much particularly the first artist that we're going to look at, whose name is George Seurat. So I just wanted to show you this. It's a really interesting page out of a book dated 1879, right? So think about the dates, if you guys remember. We looked at 1872, I believe. Yep, that was the date of the painting Impressionist Sunrise, the painting that gives the whole movement its name. And you see here, just a few 7 years later, this guy, Ogden N. Rood, wrote a whole book about color theory and how the eye sees complementary colors, the mixture chart, etc. So it's really, really going to be very important when we look at this painting. So the first painting that we're going to talk about today is this one, George Seurat, and the painting is called Sunday on La Grande Jatte. Now, it's really important that you guys understand this shift that happens now in Post-Impressionism, and it can really be summarized in this statement by George Seurat. It's one of my favorite statements when it comes to the history of art and the way an artist talks about his work. And he says, "Some say they see poetry in my painting, but I see only science." Now think about what that might mean to you guys, if anything. Some say they see poetry in my paintings, and others think they only see science. And it's really sort of to get back to this, that George Seurat is using this concept of color theory and science to make his art. And so there's two terms that we're going to be using today. I want to see if I can type something and let you guys, yeah, I'm going to try something here. So one of the key differences between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism is we have this term called optical mixing. Optical mixing. What does that mean? It means that instead of putting color onto the palette where the artist mixes the color and he mixes it, and it's all being done on the palette until he gets that perfect blue, and then he takes the paintbrush and he dips it in the paint and he puts it up onto the canvas. Instead of doing that, the artist is doing something very different. What is he doing? He's putting little dots of paint on the canvas. And this is a detail of the painting we're going to be talking about. Okay, pure dots of color, and you can kind of see it here. Okay, and instead of mixing the paint on the canvas, the artist is letting the eye do the mixing, and that's called optical mixing. This develops a new style of painting that we associate with Georges Seurat called pointillism. Let me make it bigger. Pointillism. Pointillism is the result of this optical mixing. So you put pure color down on the canvas in these little dots next to each other, understanding this whole concept of color theory, right? Understanding that he is interested in science, and you're going to get a painting like this. Okay, so let's learn a little bit about this painting, A Sunday on the Grand Jatte by Georges Seurat. And notice, guys, how big it is, right? It's almost 7 feet tall by 10 feet wide. So this is a massive painting. Okay.
Some say they see poetry in my paintings. I see.
Oops, sorry. Hold on one second.
Some say they see poetry in my paintings. I see only science.
We're in the Art Institute of Chicago, and we're looking at Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of the Grand Jatte by Georges Seurat.
And that was a quote by Seurat, whose ambition was to bring science to the methods of Impressionism.
What's interesting is that the science that he was thinking about has been, to some extent, overturned, and we're left with the poetry.
The science that he was referring to had to do with ways of making the painting seem more luminous, to seem brighter.
And I have to say, he's really succeeded. This is a painting that is brilliantly luminous and incredibly complex when it comes to color. So he's taking the earlier traditions of the Impressionists, and he's imposing on them the science of vision, and especially the science of color that had been developed by people like Chevreul and Rude. He was interested in this idea of dividing color into its components. That is, instead of trying to find the perfect purple, which is really hard to do.
You mean when you mix it on your palette?
Well, that's right. And the reason is that when you take, say, a blue and a red, and you mix them together, that red is not pure red. It's got lots of other things in it. The blue is not pure, and when you mix them together, it gets too muddy. So how do you get a pure purple that you might see in nature? Well, Seurat's solution was to take the red, take the blue, and put them next to each other, so that as your eye receives that light, the light waves do the mixing themselves.
Right, and this is called optical mixture, and this is really a change from academic technique of finding that local color of an object, mixing it on your palette and then applying it. And if you think back to the Impressionist project, that what the Impressionists sought after was to really create a sense of outdoor light. And I think using this divisionist method, this idea of optical mixture, Seurat really did that in the Grand Jatte. We have a real sense of Parisians outside on a sunny day and the real strong sense of sunlight streaming through the trees.
So clearly there is this bridge back to Impressionism, and in fact the artist used the term Neo-Impressionism when he described the kind of painting that he was doing. And yet this is also so far away from Impressionism. It's got the leisure of the Impressionist painting, it's got the outside, but this is not a painting that was painted plein air. This is not done directly before these subjects. He did do small sketches.
Actually dozens of drawings and oil sketches outside, that's right.
But then he goes back to the studio and makes this very composed, very carefully structured painting. In fact, he said that he wanted his figures to have the kind of solemnity that was found in the sculptures of the frieze of the Parthenon.
Right,
So that's the first thing I want you guys to definitely notice and pay attention to, is that this idea of being outdoors, right? Painting en plein air, being outside, is kind of done. And that's something that Monet does. That's something that the Impressionists do. And it was a really big deal for artists to kind of leave their studios and go outside. And it also explains why so many of their paintings had that quickness, that kind of brushy, sketchy feel to it. But Seurat goes back into the studio. Obviously, if you're going to make a painting that's 7 feet tall by 10 feet wide, it's pretty hard to be walking down the street carrying that canvas. But he wants to take the lesson from being out of doors and then take it back to his studio, back inside, and make a composition. And when we talk about the the layout, right, the actual composition of the painting, we'll see that it's definitely not anything that would have been spontaneous. And so he says, as you see by this slide here, you should recognize one of our beautiful relief sculptures from the frieze of the Parthenon, that he wanted sort of this timelessness and classicism that he felt Impressionism didn't have. So he's really kind of bashing Impressionism and saying, I'm going to improve on it.
Wanting to bring a sense of timelessness and classicism to the art of Impressionism, and also, as you said, a sense of thoughtfulness, of composing, of not doing something spontaneous.
The figures are remarkably structured within this space, and the space itself is also remarkably organized.
And there's much more of an illusion of space than we would ever get in an Impressionist painting.
Well, almost going back to the classical tradition of landscape painting, of Claude or of Poussin, you have alternating shadow and light, which steps us back slowly into space.
And we also have a receding diagonal line that creates an illusion of space.
And yet at the same time, this is a painting, because of its technique, that really draws our eye to the surface of the canvas. So there's this really interesting tension that exists between this deep pictorial space and the very obvious, heavily worked surface. Let's go up really close and take a look. So I'm looking at the lower left corner of the painting, and I'm looking at the man who's smoking a pipe, leaning on his back. Take a close look at the way that his body is defined. You can see some of the earlier painting. I see blues, I see reds, and I see yellows, all fairly long strokes. But then I also see, painted over that, little points of color, of pinks and of blues as well, that Seurat actually added a bit later. And you can see that, especially in the shadows and the highlights at the top and the bottom, where Seurat, in a sense, creates a kind of volume.
And as we're looking at all of these different brush strokes that are layered one on the other, I'm also noticing how the figure has really clear contours, which is something that we don't see in Impressionism. So we have a sense of line here and a form defined by line and even modeling. So the figure really seems three-dimensional. So we know that we're in the northwest of Paris, in a place that was frequented by the middle and upper classes for leisure. We know that the other side of the river was frequented more by working class figures. And so there's this question of what Seurat is saying about class in Paris in the 19th century.
And here, art historians really disagree. And it's in part because there's a lot of ambiguity. The ambiguity of class was an issue of his moment, of his time. Class was enormously important, and it had always been in French society absolutely clear. But the cities had a way now of mixing classes, and this was a modern phenomenon.
There was a way that clothing and fashion now blurred class distinctions that were more clear before. One of the things that Seurat is doing is he's confounding the expectations of a typical viewer in the end of the 19th century. So where someone would expect to see a narrative,
Okay. I think that that's enough. You guys get the idea of the video, and if you want, certainly you can watch the rest of it, but I want to go back to my PowerPoint and talk specifically about the things that I'd like you guys to know about the painting. Okay, so here we are. We're back looking at the painting, and let's just go over some of the really cool things that we learned. And I wanted to just say that this term, post-impressionism, right? Where is it? This term post-impressionism is actually a term that's coined in 1910. And I want to warn you guys that going forward now, for the rest of the class, we're going to be learning about all these different movements that end in ism, right? But what the main difference is between the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists is that rather than the impression, the mere sort of recording of the optical effects of light on a surface that the Impressionists were so interested in, the Post-Impressionists actually want to get much more of a feeling, or as we will use the term, expression of the kind of internal process and the reaction of the individual, the psychology of the individual. So there are painters that move through Impressionism, they try Impressionism, and then they're actually going to go and end up being Post-Impressionists, where they're looking for more of formal order and structure rather than the spontaneity, right, that the Impressionists were trying to capture. And so now's an interesting moment to ask yourselves, you know, well, what do you think is more interesting? What would you rather be working on and capturing? Just a mere impression, or kind of the more underlying structure of nature? It's not that one is better than the other, it's just that they are two different ways of looking at the world. So the last couple of points that I want to make about the painting that I want you to know is that, again, it is this technique called pointillism, right? The dots, the points, pointillism. It is really much more of a timeless and classic composition, right? It is not spontaneous. Seurat made this painting in his studio, and he very carefully composed the people in it, the upper class guys you see here, the guy with the top hat sitting on the ground next to more of a working class guy. By the way, you can see this woman here. She's got a pet monkey, right, on some sort of a leash with her little very typical dress with the big back area. Forget what it's called. And you can see that this was clearly not a random grouping of people the way they're all seated. There is a very profound interest here in shadow and light. And it's a very, a painting that you could say has deep space with repeating forms that create these patterns and rhythms. It also captures the new social and class relationships that are very much part of the modern world. And the last thing I want to say is that it celebrates the new ideal of the public parks, right? The public parks that become, really an important part of major cities as a response to the industrial growth, the antidote to urban stress, and kind of the more chaotic crowds and litter that will become quite typical of living in the city. The next post-impressionist artist that I want to talk about is a wonderful artist named Paul Cézanne. And we are going to be looking at basically two different kinds of paintings that he does. One is a still life composition. Still life is kind of when you set things up, like a basket of fruit, a bowl, a vase of flowers. And of course, the other one is landscape painting that you can see here. What's interesting about Paul Cézanne is that he is considered to be, by Picasso, the father of Cubism. And I want you to think, when you're looking at these paintings, and this one in particular, what is it that Cézanne is doing that is very, very different than what we just saw with Seurat, with the dots? And that is that he creates a much more structured work of art, where instead of having little dots, he's actually using shapes. He actually said that everything can be reduced to the cone, the sphere, and the cylinder. And geometric shapes, according to Cézanne, gives form to paintings. So Picasso really felt that he was, in fact, the father of us all. And so we're going to talk about this. So first thing I want to do is I want to show you, this is a photograph of Mont Saint-Victoire, and you can see that it's a beautiful mountain in the south of France. And actually, Cézanne goes down there and he lives with his, I believe it's his brother and sister-in-law. And he actually makes many paintings of many versions of this painting. So like Monet, who did the series, we have this series of paintings by Cézanne. So I just want you guys to look at a couple of versions of the painting, right? If you look at this first one, you see the mountain in the distance, right? You see this kind of bridge or train tracks. You see the landscape, and you see this tree in the front. But then he does this version of the painting, and I'm putting them together so that you can kind of compare them, right? This is the one we just looked at, and now we're looking at this painting here, right? What are the differences? Look at it closely and try to look at and see the differences. I'm going to show you another version of it. Can you see this? Look at this painting. And actually, here's a detail. And then compare it to this earlier version that we saw. Right? I think that you can see pretty clearly that instead of putting dots on the canvas, what is Cezanne doing? He's making these kind of geometric shapes of paint, of color. And it's really beautiful, right? When you look at it and you see, wow, that's how he sees the sky. That's how he sees a cloud. This is how he sees the mountain and the light hitting the mountain. But when you think about it, this is extremely abstract, right? The guy is making these paintings right around 1900. And look at how abstract. If you saw this, just this section of the painting, you would think that this was a work of art that was created today. So now you can say, oh, I get it. When Picasso says that Cezanne, Paul Cezanne, is the father of us all, I see why. Because Picasso, who is going to be known as the great Cubist painter, is inspired by the geometry in the paintings by Paul Cezanne. So Cezanne turns to this, he returns to this motif of Mont Saint-Victoire throughout the rest of his career. And it results in this really incredibly varied series of works that show the mountain from many different points of view and in a relationship to a constantly changing cast of foreground and bushes and buildings and bridges. And it's wonderful to see that an artist can really work and rework a composition over and over again, where he's exploring these ideas of flatness, of depth, that can both coexist at the same time. And, you know, when you compare it again to this kind of early in the first version that he does of Mont Saint-Victoire, which is, I guess this one is in 1887, we can grasp some of these, you know, subtle changes that he does as he moves forward in time to the painting, to this one that he's doing in 1902 and 1904. And again, this is the detail of it. And, you know, we can see, kind of get into the mind of Cezanne, how his interest of what he's exploring changes, right? The triangles, the blocks of color are really important, as well as the brush strokes that we can so feel. And we know that we learned about this with Manet. You know, this was one of the things that the critics of the art world hated, was that, you know, you could see the hand of the artist. But it becomes a value that's really loved and enjoyed in modern art. So again, this is what he's looking at, right? This is what he starts to paint. And then he evolves away from that into these more geometric paintings. The other thing that Cezanne is known for are his still lifes. And this is a really interesting kind of digression. It's very, very different away from the certainly the landscapes. And you can see that what he's doing is he's really ignoring what we would call the classical laws of perspective, right? Perspective means, and we learned about Brunelleschi, who invented perspective during the Renaissance, that in fact objects that are closer to you would be bigger. As they recede towards a vanishing point, they get smaller. And we also learned about atmospheric or aerial perspective, where things that are farther away are more out of focus or blurry, right? The way our eye works. But in fact, when Cezanne does still life, he ignores these laws and he allows each object to be independent within the space of the picture. So the relationship of one object to another is more important than this kind of idea of overall perspective. And we're going to explore this by looking at this painting right now. So I want you guys to take a look at this painting and see if you can just ask yourself, what seems to be a little bit weird about this painting, right? What seems to be a little bit off? And if you're noticing that there are these weird spatial ambiguities, then you are right. So let me see if I can draw on this painting. Go. Okay. So the first thing to notice is if you drew a line across the back of the table, right? You'd expect that line to continue here, right? But look where it is. It's down here. So already we have something weird going on. Okay. The next thing is these guys over here, and I like to call them the Twinkies, right? It looks like they're kind of artificially flipped up. What am I talking about? It looks like we're looking at them from above, as if we're looking down at them, but then it looks like we're looking directly at them, right? As if we're standing in two different places. The same thing is true of the bottle. It looks like we're seeing the top of it, the side of it, the basket that's flipped up. And then again, we don't really believe that this table is a flat surface. Certainly we got this line thing going on in the background, right? But we also don't believe that all of these objects, these apples, are not going to just completely roll right down off the table. So when we talk about spatial ambiguities, that's really what we're talking about here, right? All of these kind of weird, crazy relationships. The wine bottle actually has two different silhouettes. This side of the bottle and this side of the bottle are completely different. The pastries are tilted toward the viewer, and we know from some findings that were done in Cézanne's studio that in fact he did tilt up the basket, the fruit. He put little coins behind them, and he liked to, really set each one up individually. So it's a very interesting thing to see how these modern ideas are affecting an artist like Cézanne, where he's not kind of following the traditional rules, but really making them up as he goes. And he's doing it on purpose, right? They're not errors that, are because he's a bad painter. But he wants us to understand a new way of looking at objects and at a relationship between objects. And also the distinction between human vision and the camera, right? So he's quite influenced by photography as well. And he'd been known to say that human vision is actually complicated. And human vision is not like this frozen vision that a camera will provide. That in fact, people see through both time and space. Meaning that we are looking at something, but typically we move. And we're going to see this with Picasso, where it'll look like he's making a portrait of somebody looking straight ahead, and yet the eye will be in profile. And Picasso was known to have thought that, well, while I was sitting here painting a portrait, the sitter turned their head. So how do you integrate more than one viewpoint at a time into something, into a composition? And it's really, really interesting to think that these artists are concerned with this very careful discovery of how we exist, how people live in the world, and in fact, how we see. So Cézanne was quite proud of the fact that he was creating paintings that were trying to show the experience of looking through multiple perspectives. And he knew that he was changing the direction of painting while he was doing this. We're going to talk about Vincent van Gogh, a wonderful artist, a tragic artist who really had such a difficult and such a sad life. And I want to start with a painting that many of you are going to recognize, I hope, and that is the painting of Starry Night. And I just want to show you kind of this photograph of Starry Night. It is in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. So if you ever have a chance to go there, it's always wonderful to see these paintings in person. And I like to show you this image of the painting because you get a sense of the scale, right? If I just show you this version of the painting, you're like, okay, I don't really, it doesn't mean anything to me. How big is it? How small is it? I see she wrote 2 feet 5 inches by 3 feet and a quarter, blah, blah, blah. But here you do get a sense. And I think it's always cool to know what the actual size of a painting is. We know that Vincent van Gogh lived quite a tortured life. He died penniless of what we believe was a self-inflicted wound. He really never saw any of his paintings sold in his lifetime, and it is really ironic that today he is probably one of the most famous artists whose paintings sell for many, many, many millions of dollars. Unlike the other artists that we looked at, the Gauguin with his points and Seurat with his, Cézanne with his geometric shapes and cubes, Van Gogh is known for his thick application of paint, that we call, see, I'm gonna write this down so you guys can see. Not pointillism, impasto. Impasto literally means the thick application, sorry about the caps, of paint to a canvas, right? Thick application of paint. Now look at this word, impasto. Can everyone look at this word for a second, right? What does that word look like or sound like? Impasto. You guys see it? Well, if you said pasta, you were right. Pasta, impasto. And what that does is it refers to this very thick way, these broad strokes of color, this like big gooey strips that in the way that Vincent van Gogh is putting the paint on the canvas. So let's talk about this painting in detail, okay? So, all right. Just to cut to the chase, I guess Van Gogh has a breakdown in 1888, and it's kind of the famous time period where he mutilates his own ear. There's all these stories about his girlfriend or a prostitute who cut off his ear. We're not really sure. But anyway, he goes and he admits himself to an asylum for the mentally ill near the town of Saint Remy. And when he was there convalescing, I guess in quarantine, right? He was encouraged to paint. And though he really rarely ventured more than a few hundred yards away from outside the walls of the asylum, it's believed, in fact, that this was the view that he saw. And he said that he knows his paintings, he knows that they are exaggerations, but that he felt the most important thing to do was to express the way he feels about art. And that art really was all about expression of feeling. And that's something new that we haven't seen before, right? This is kind of a new value that Van Gogh is pursuing. And so this is a really interesting thing. I want you guys to look at this quote that I have written down up here by Van Gogh. Van Gogh said, "Color has to do everything. Color has to do everything." And this is, in fact, a really important idea, right? For, a modern artist where the subject of the painting now is less important, whether it's a bowl of fruit or a mountain, but that the color becomes the formal elements, and that these things can in fact be expressive on their own. So this is the root of abstraction, right? And this is what creates the formal qualities of the painting. Just like music that uses pure tone, color itself can have an emotional value, okay? Color can have an emotional value. And so this is really important as Van Gogh continues to move through many, many different styles, and you can see that here. So it's a really a beautiful thing to think about. Oops. Right, so when you look at this painting of Starry Night, again, you see the mountains, the trees. What's interesting is if you look at this church here, right, you see that actually the landscape and the shape of these trees is echoed but supersedes. It's bigger than the church. Notice kind of these swirling forms, right? The stars, maybe the moon, or maybe this is the moon and maybe this is the sun. And look at how he's trying to give energy and shape to the wind. He was a wonderful kind of philosopher, and he said, real painters do not paint things as they are. They paint themselves, they paint them as they themselves feel them to be. Feel them to be. So once again, we're back with this idea that for Van Gogh, it's really expressing your feelings that are the most important things. Now, I want to show you something really interesting because Van Gogh is actually a Dutch painter. And if you can remember back to maybe a few paintings that you looked at, say of Rembrandt a few weeks ago, you can remember that the palette of the Dutch painters is pretty dark, right? It's pretty morose. It's kind of browns and grays and blacks. And this is a painting that is a pretty famous painting by Van Gogh, painting these very poor people called the potato eaters. And he was quite interested in, you know, people who were underclass, lower class, which he related to himself. And I wanted you to look at this image here of these wooden shoes, because wooden shoes or clogs was a symbol of poverty. You were so poor that you couldn't afford a shoe that would have been made out of leather, and you had to sort of carve your own shoes out of wood. And you can see this kind of whole palette here. But what happens is that Van Gogh ends up going to Paris, and he sees the work of the Impressionists, right? And he gets kind of blown out of the water when he sees all of the beautiful color that they're using in their works of art. And he immediately changes his entire way of thinking. And I just want to show you a couple of still lifes that Vincent van Gogh makes. I'm sorry, not still life, self-portraits, right? You can see the self-portrait, and maybe you can put the video on pause and zoom in. And you can see here again the technique that we were talking about with impasto, right? The thick application of paint. But I want you guys just look at this area for a minute, right? Look at the way he's using color. Remember we said color has to do everything? Look at the yellow he's using here in the eyebrow, and look at these little sort of pieces of red that he's using to outline the eye. Look at the red here, these lines that he's using, 1, 2, 3. And then the green, and kind of, even if you look at the shadows that he's using here in the face, right? The color, the green, you know, these are not colors that are necessarily associated with reality, right? But they are in fact colors that are really very effectively conveying shadow and hair and eyes and skin. And so this idea that color has to do everything is something that Van Gogh is, you know, he's just, that's his priority. That's the important thing that he is doing. I just want to show you a couple of really cool images. This is a painting that is supposed to be one of these bridges. And when I was in Amsterdam a few years ago, I was able to actually see one of these bridges. And I then went to the Van Gogh Museum, and I got to see a painting of this exact bridge. So I wanted to show you that. It's kind of cool to see the real thing and then Van Gogh's interpretation of it. The other thing is Van Gogh was so poor that he couldn't take chances and mix paint and just try to see what the optical effects would be. And so if you look at this box here on the upper left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that it came from Van Gogh's painting studio. And in fact, he actually would mix different wools together and put them next to each other to see what the effect of colors would be next to each other. And I love this quote where he says, "In life and in painting too, I can easily do without the dear Lord, but I can't, suffering as I do without something greater than myself, which is my life, the power to create." And I want to tell you guys that this is actually a really interesting quote, because in fact, one of the first things that Van Gogh tried to be was a minister, and he failed miserably at it. He was really, the poor guy did not have much success at many, many different things until he found painting. And the success that he had, as I mentioned earlier, was only after he died. Again, this is sort of a beautiful painting that he made of his room in the asylum, the mental institution that he himself committed himself to. And I think it's a really beautiful painting, and very sad, but very poignant, that this is like his world. And I think we can all relate to this right now, in sort of the middle and the moment of our own quarantines. These are all the things that are most important to him and in a way symbolize his life, right? His single bed, his few articles of clothing, his paintings, and then the window that we believe he looked out of when he painted The Starry Night. At the end of his life, this is a self-portrait, we believe, even though he calls it Old Man, he arrives at kind of these last paintings of the sower or the wheat field with crows. And I wanted to just show you guys this one, where you can see that there's a path, right? There's a path here that kind of ends, right? It stops. The sun is setting and the sower is walking kind of away. And this painting, that is believed to be 1890, the last painting he makes before he unfortunately shoots himself, is kind of, crows, which are a symbol of death, kind of a real chaotic piece. And again, this path that stops in the middle of the field. So one of the reasons that we do know so much about Vincent van Gogh, we're very, very lucky that he wrote many letters to his brother Theo. And we know that unlike today, where people text and do all kinds of things, that there's going to be no record of our thoughts, we know a lot about Van Gogh, and we know what he thought and what he felt because we have those documents. Before we leave Van Gogh, I just wanted to show you this painting because, as I mentioned, there's all these different theories about Van Gogh's ear. And did he cut it off himself to get attention? Did his girlfriend, who may or may not have been a prostitute, cut it off? Like, did Gauguin, his friend, who he was living with in the south of France and painting, and then they had a fight, and Gauguin picks up and leaves and goes back to Paris. Did he cut his ear off? Maybe you guys can do a little bit of poking around and let me know what you find and what your theory is about the bandage deer. But I did want to show you this, and I wanted you to notice what he puts in the background, right? Which is this Japanese print. And if you guys remember, we talked a little bit earlier about Degas and some of the other Impressionists and how they were in fact interested in Japanese art. And here you can see on the left a Japanese print by Hiroshige, and we know that Van Gogh studied it really, really carefully and made a painted version of it. And I think that the same things I said in the last lecture about why Japanese art appealed to these artists so much is because of the flatness, right? Because of the composition. I mean, look at how abstract this really is. The tree that kind of comes in and out of the canvas without the beginning or the end. And it's a very, very graphic work of art. And so artists are being influenced by many different sources, and I wanted you just to really see that Japanese art is also important to Van Gogh. So I want you guys to think about that. Another artist who is considered to be a post-impressionist is Gauguin. And the reason I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about this piece is that Gauguin, this piece of art is here in Boston at the MFA, and it's massive, right? It's really, really quite big. It's 12 feet long by about 4.5 feet high. And it's a really interesting piece. It's kind of a philosophical piece where he asks the question, you know, where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? And, you know, it's this brilliantly colored, but weird, enigmatic work. And it contains animal and human and symbolic figures that are arranged across the surface. It was painted in Tahiti, where Gauguin goes and lives. And we believe that it's, you know, really has many different themes in it of death, life, and kind of that whole cycle of life. So where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Again, it's a very kind of interesting painting. And I want you guys to know that one of the reasons that Gauguin goes to Tahiti is that there is, I believe it's once a month, there's a boat that goes back and forth between Tahiti and France. And so Gauguin is able to send paintings back to France to be sold, and his dealer is able to send him money. He did have a wife and children in France, but that didn't stop him from taking one of these beautiful Tahitian women or two to be his lover as well. So he was a bit of a weird guy. And here he is. I wanted to show you this portrait of him. It's really interesting because he kind of shows himself kind of with this halo, and yet he also is making reference to the fall of man, right? Sin, where you've got the apple and you have the snake, and you can kind of see the snake here wrapped around his fingers. So he's saying, hey, I'm not, you know, necessarily, I'm not an innocent, I'm not such an angel myself, but listen, he was having a good time. So that's really something that I wanted you guys to see and to think about Gauguin as another post-impressionist who's kind of looking at the world through his eyes, through his Tahitian eyes, and notice again, all of a sudden, how color is now really detached from any reference to the outside world, right? There's no desire here to make this look kind of realistic in the sense of what color has to be. So I wanted you guys to look at these beautiful works by Gauguin. The last artist we're going to talk about today is probably one of my favorite, Mr. Matisse, and we could probably have a whole class on Matisse. I'm not going to do that to you guys, but I do want to kind of show you some amazing works of art by our friend Mr. Matisse, and I'm going to do it in a really interesting way. So the first thing I want to do is show you a still life, okay, that Matisse does kind of really early on. It's called The Dinner Table, 1897, and if you look at it, you can actually see things that maybe we understand and maybe we relate to from the Cézanne still lifes that we looked at, right? Just to remind you guys, you know, the palette, here's the Cézanne painting. The palette is similar. Perhaps, I don't know, the way the fruits are represented, you know, some of these elements that we associate with Cézanne, we also can see in this very early painting by Matisse. But Matisse is going to be the father of a movement that is called Fauvism. And the word fauve, which you see it up here at the top, literally means wild beasts. And you can see pretty quickly, right, only about 10 years or so later, 10 or 12 years later, that he moves from doing a still life like this. So you see the woman, you see the flowers, you see the table, the walls, the furniture, and everything seems to be pretty clear what's what. Like we look at this and we believe it, to now this composition, right? And Matisse says it right away, right? He's like, we reject imitative colors, right? We don't care about that. We want pure color to obtain strong reaction and strong feeling, right? And so when you look at it, you really see that it's not clear at all what is in fact the wall, right? What is the wallpaper? What is, you know, where's the edge of the table? And if you look at it closely, I'm going to see if I can show this to you guys. Let me see. There is a line here that is sort of outlining the back edge of the table, right? But then it stops right there. It stops. And so there's no line down here, right? There's no line here. And so and there's no line, you know, behind her. So this kind of disappears. And we don't know, like, is this wallpaper in the background? And if it's wallpaper, then why does this kind of pattern continue onto the table? Does the wallpaper become the tablecloth? And, you know, is it a table? I mean, well, we see a chair back here that's being hidden by kind of the surface of, you know, whatever this is. We're assuming it's a tablecloth. We're assuming it's a table. And yet, it doesn't, there's no sort of separation here between what's behind the chair and what is next to the chair. Is this in fact a window? Is it a painting? You know, what is going on here? And all these spatial ambiguities are very important to Matisse, and it's really, you know, some people thought that the guy didn't know how to paint, you know, and what I want to just tell you is that no, he is in fact doing all of this on purpose, right? And he really believes that color is the ultimate thing, that everything needs to be subjugated or put aside underneath the ultimate value that color and form is what he wants to express. And if you remember the Seurat quote that he says, some people see poetry in my paintings, I see only science. Matisse says, no, I don't, you know, I'm not worried about that. Color doesn't rest on a scientific theory in my paintings. I am just painting, you know, what I observe based on my sensitivity, based on my felt experiences. And so, you know, he becomes kind of the symbol of this movement called Fauvism that's characterized, and Fauvism means wild beasts, right? So again, this should remind you guys when the Impressionists were given their name, you know, that was an insult. Well, of course, being called a fauve artist was also an insult. You were a wild beast. And it's really just this kind of expressive use of color, expressing the potential of color, and of course, the very distinctive brushwork. And so I want you guys to look at this portrait. It is a portrait of his wife, Madame Matisse, and I guess it would be kind of cool to know, well, what did she think of this, right? And I want you guys just to look at some of the details here, right? Look at how whatever this shadow is, or whatever this highlight is of the way light is hitting her, her face and her hair, he literally turns it into, this triangle, right? Look at how he's using color on this side of her face, right? Look at the green, right? Look at how I'm going to blow this up for you guys. Oop, no, let me close this out. Look at how he is able to, can you guys see this? Look at the different colors he's using here, the green, the yellow. Look at it, you can feel his hand, right? Look at these kind of strokes of color, this stroke of red and the green, and look at how he's making this shadow here under her nose. These splotches of color, right? You can feel it. Look at that. This little stroke of red here, right? They're so beautiful and they're so interesting, the way he is able to manipulate the brush, right? And look at the background. It's divided into these kind of, simple shapes. It's very, very modern. And sometimes, and I know I've said this to you guys before, sometimes it's not that in life that you've done something, but that you've done it first, right? And Matisse is really the first person to do this, to use color in this way. You can see it here in this self-portrait as well, right? You can see it here in this kind of, these splotches of color, right? Look at how he's using this green, right, to make shadow, to make light. Look at this, boom, one splotch of color that he puts on here. Even the way the ear is created. So I love his paintings so much. To me, they're so real and so powerful. He was able to paint traditionally, right? These are some of his early paintings, and I want to show you this portrait of him when he's young in his studio. And don't forget, I showed you this work of art. So it's not that he can't paint like this if he didn't want to. He is choosing to make his art like this. And what is it? Why is he doing these things? It's because he is in fact trying to explore the potentially expressive use of color. I want to do something really fun with you guys right now, okay? I want you to look at this painting. And I want you to think about this term, this expression that I wrote down here, because we're going to actually be coming back to this later in the course. This expression, less is more, right? Less is more. And I want you guys to take a minute and think about, what does that mean, less is more? Less is more. It's really kind of an expression of the modern world. So take a couple of minutes and think, what does this concept, less is more, mean? So I remember the first time I saw this painting, and my art history professor put the painting up on the board and said, on the screen, and said, okay, let's look at this painting by Matisse. What do you think? And I remember very well, I thought, I don't know. I mean, like, I don't know. What is it? It's kind of like weird, there's this kind of weird square or shape at the top with this black, and then it's got these lines, and it's got this weird green blob on the right, and I don't know. I mean, there's nothing really so interesting about it. But then she said to us, now I want to show you something else. This is a view of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and Matisse looking out his window. And she showed us this. She showed us this series of 3 paintings that Matisse was making that ultimately led to this one on the left, and that finally allowed him to arrive back at the one that we see on the right, this one. And now I got it. Now I understood why this was so interesting. So Matisse rents a studio in a building, and this is the view that he has. And he's looking out his window, and he's actually experimenting with 3 different styles, or he's just experimenting with different styles of making art, right? On the far right, this one here, you could say that certainly this painting and the style of it is influenced by, say, Monet, right? It's sketchy, it's quick, it's, we can see clearly it does look like a church and a bridge and people and the river Seine, right? And we understand what this painting is. Then the next one, Matisse is like, okay, I'm going to try another style of painting. And if you look at it, you can see that it's much more solid. Look at how he's using kind of pink and green to create the light and shadow on the church. And, there's a different attitude here about how color is being used and how it's creating shape and form. And then the last version of the painting, I would say, is a little bit more of a Cézanne take, where the color is going down in more geometric shapes, maybe even Van Gogh. But in each of them, we understand that this is some sort of a landscape, some sort of a building and water and a bridge. And then he takes it and he moves away from that into kind of this painting on the left, right? And the jump, and by the way, guys, I want you to see here that you see this kind of solid up and down line, this vertical line. We know that this is the edge of the building, and then the shutter, the window that has been opened up. But what's interesting and important for me, for you guys to note, is what happens, right? Where is the transition? And when I say less is more, this is kind of the full circle moment that we're coming back to. What am I talking about? Here's a bridge, right? Here's a bridge. What is the bridge? It's a horizontal element. It's this arc that kind of holds it up. But for Matisse, all of this can be boiled down into 1, 2, 3 elements, right? Less is more. This is all you need to say bridge. The same thing is true of all of this greenery, right? All of the greenery that is here that he sees outside of his window. All of that can be reduced simply to this one green blob. And the church, this great Gothic cathedral that is a symbol of France, and by the way, you guys know that it's Notre Dame that had the terrible fire, I believe, last year, can be reduced to this, right? These curves, maybe the big stained glass rosette window to that, and sort of the structure, right? And then even this idea of the side of the building and the structure of the shutter that's open, right? All of this stuff is reduced to one single line. So less is more in the language of a fauve like Matisse is very much made clear, I think, through this visual journey that I took you on, that I hope now, if you saw this painting, you would look at it in a very, very different way. The last thing we're going to learn about Matisse is that he made art until the end of his life. And when he became sick in the latter years of his life, and he really couldn't work anymore, he couldn't paint, what he did were collages. And he had his assistants paint these large pieces of paper, and he would cut with scissors, and he would direct them where to hang and where to place the collages. And he said that when he got to this stage of his life, it was actually one of the most profound and creative parts of his life, because he said that he was cutting into pure color. And you can see, this is a work of art that he called The Snail. And these beautiful works, the blue nude, right? If you look at it really closely, you can see kind of how he has just cut these pieces of blue paper, and even the white, the negative space, adds so much to our understanding of how Matisse was able to see and clearly understand pure form. So these are a lot of his late works when he's in his bed and he's directing his assistant, see 1952, of how to put together. You can see the colors. So collage is a wonderful medium and a very expressive medium that he's using at the end of his life. So that's really what I wanted you to know about Matisse, the Fauve. This is a portrait actually that he did of a woman, and you can see again how he's using color here, and it was quite a thing when this painting was found and was seen. And I just wanted to go through some of the other beautiful Matisse paintings that I love. The Dance. Something that he does that's really interesting is he'll do a painting and then he'll make another painting and he'll put the first painting into it, right? Because he's looking around his studio and he is just making art from everything around him. Okay, so that is going to be our lecture for today on the Post-Impressionists. And I think that one of the things that I really want you guys to understand is that, we saw several different Post-Impressionists. We learned about, of course, Seurat and his pointillist technique. We learned about Cézanne and the way he sees the world, right, from looking at this kind of series of paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire. We learned about Van Gogh and his issues and his challenges and what he's pursuing in his art. And we also looked at this work by our friend Gauguin, that is here in the MFA, and then of course Matisse, and so many things to talk about and think about with Matisse. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Let me know your thoughts and try to answer some of the questions that I've presented you with. And again, the assignment is for you to just take notes on the video and the videos that I showed you within the PowerPoint and the PowerPoint itself, and send them to me, and I will grade your notes. Okay? Thanks, guys. See you next week. Thank you.